so excited today to have our guest and our host, Bob Johansen. I'm just going to ease us into this Foresight Talks and give you a sense of a little bit of the context. We hold these talks and these webinars to help the community deepen all of our knowledge and our learning about the practice of foresight and the impacts of foresight. So we love to have these conversations with people who are experts at using foresight to change the present. And that is what we're going to be hearing about today. So I'm going to go to a few housekeeping things. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom, feel free to introduce yourself. We have a wonderful crowd of about 55 people at the moment, and I'm sure that more will be joining. I see more joining as I say this. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. If you want, make sure that you choose everyone. Otherwise, sometimes if you choose host and panelists for the chat, we will be the only ones who will see it and not everyone else will. There's also a Q&A where you're welcome to put questions, and half of this session will be your questions. So please do keep the questions coming. We will be monitoring them in the chat and we'll tee them up for Deborah and Bob. We will be, as I said, having the conversation. We'll spend a lot of time with Q&A. A brief introduction to myself and to the Institute. My name is Lynn Jeffrey, and I lead the training and teaching part of the Institute. IFTF is an independent nonprofit organization. We've been around 55 plus years, and we really do help organizations and leaders become better at preparing themselves for the future, about developing a foresight mindset. We have all different kinds of ways we do that. We work directly with organizations to produce all kinds of research, and we'll be hearing about some of that today. We have an organizational membership program called Vantage, where you get to kind of stay in the flow and in the know with all of the research and the methods innovation that we're doing at the Institute. And of course, we have the piece of the Institute that I lead, which is the training and developing foresight skills. And if you have not joined us for any of those, here's a quick flash of the things that are coming up. We have a lot of different kinds of programs, short programs, long programs, cheap programs, expensive programs. And we would just love to see you and continue the conversation about becoming, deepening your foresight practice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my wonderful colleague, the former president of the Institute for the Future, now a distinguished fellow, author of multiple books, many of which many of you have read, and turn it over to Bob to host our conversation with Deborah.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and hello, everybody. This is our chance. This is our chance to take a deep look at a particular case that started with a question and started with a kind of a dilemma, a puzzle, but it actually did scale. And people in the foresight field, those of us who want to bring foresight and spread foresight, we're always puzzling about, how do we get this going? And more importantly, how can we keep it going? How can we scale it? So Deborah and I are going to be talking this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are. We're going to be talking about her experience. And I want to start, Deborah, just with a little bit about your background, because that's important. So you're an expert in talent, in executive development, in organizational change. That's your doctorate. And you sort of beginning from this point are kind of how you got interested in foresight. But if you could say a little bit about your background and kind of how that kindled your interest.
Sounds great. Well, I'm a learning person. I love naming my frame when I start something like this. So in terms of HR land and business land, my interests and capabilities are in developing talent, identifying people who have potential for more, and creating a rich learning experience for them so that they grow into their full capability in whatever organization they're in. Very specifically, I have been a learning leader in several companies and feel really fortunate to have learned at the front lines in several companies, especially, I would say, innovative companies and really culture and purpose-driven companies.
Mhm.
Imagine spending a career doing that. Very fortunate. So I actually have the bookends of two really innovative organizations. I was at Sematech, which was one of the first legal consortia in the US, where we had all these competitors in the semiconductor manufacturing industry, and they came together. So as a learning person, what was really important for us was to have these actual competitors, but also collaborators working well together. And that set me up to notice what
Mhm.
are the elements of an environment that supports innovation. And
Mm.
I kind of ended my corporate career at W.L. Gore and Associates, which is where we'll be talking about this case study, which has been renowned since it started for deliberately setting up an environment for innovation. Like in
Mhm.
1957, when we had men in the gray flannel suit and everything about General Motors and all its floors that matched its hierarchical levels. In that environment, our founders actually created a really almost flat organization, as close as I've seen. In
Mhm.
order to have individuals be able to go after their interests, really know what the community value would be that they could create. And they just made sure that their organizational practices matched the goal of being a profound innovator. If
Mhm.
people haven't put it together, it's the company that they might recognize as the one that created Gore-Tex fabrics, Gore-Tex
Right.
jackets and so forth. But when I was there, I was also working profoundly with the medical device division, and
Mhm.
then also at the corporate level. So I guess my career is a story of how to help others be their best, be their most innovative, and how to have organizations that don't get in the way of great individuals doing that.
Great, great. Okay, so let's start. You've got this fascinating background, fascinating company. Let's start with what kindled your interest in foresight. And I remember you called me the first time, but you didn't start with that. There were some puzzles that you were struggling with internally, and you'd done a bit of foresight thinking, but you wanted to go deeper. So just start with the kind of opening context. What brought you to thinking about foresight? What led you to call?
Well, as a lot of our people on the phone will notice, is that it's almost very frequently linked with strategic thinking. Every company has plans. Hopefully, companies have strategies which reach out even further. And we really wanted to validate, challenge our strategic thinking as a privately held, family-owned company. We knew the risk was being too insular, and so we were very deliberately looking for outside in thinking that would support us in challenging our strategy and really improving it, I'd say.
Mm,
Now,
mm,
I was fortunate. Not everybody on the phone or on the call is going to have this, but our CEO, uh, who had like personal relationships with all 11,000 of us. I know that sounds strange, but she actually had that sense. And in my case, she actually did call and say, okay, you've convinced me. Leaders develop through experience. Therefore, you design an experience for our next up leaders, emerging leaders, the very next to go into the big roles in the organization. And she said, give them an experience where they have to learn by doing. Um, and part of the product is going to be to challenge, are we doing the right thinking? Is our strategy really going to take us toward what we hope for? And she said, because of who you're going to be working with, tell them that they get to create the strategy that they will inherit. And I'm like, wow. And so that I thought that'll stay with me forever as one of the most insightful things I've seen a CEO do. And very simply, I'm like, this is like the career, highlight of, the task of a lifetime. And I was working with a group at Harvard that studies, how to be the best learning leaders we can be, essentially. And out of 12 calls, I think probably 6 of them mentioned this book that had just come out. You'll recognize it, Bob. For the rest of you, it's Leaders Make the Future, 10 New Leadership Skills in an Uncertain World. And we knew that the conventional competencies. We're not really addressing this. There might be one on, strategic thinking or managing complexity, but it was just necessary but not sufficient. And whereas the ones that you had in here spoke to us, especially as an organization that was complex by design. I think in the last few years we've used the term, increasing the exposure or the interface with your customers and your partners and your industry partners. And we were already, as a flatter organization, pretty good at that. But it had enormous complexity that we also had to then match, especially our leaders did. And so your competency spoke to us, and that led to the conversation. And
so interesting timing too. That was the second edition of Leaders Make the Future, and the background image on the cover was a real internet traffic diagram done by a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon. And one of the big messages we were bringing to this custom forecast was it's going to be a connected world, and that innovation is going to come from that connectivity. It's also interesting. We just finished the third edition of that now, focused on augmented leadership, which will come out next year, and we'll have a follow-on session about that. But let's get back to the beginning here. So this was really interesting for us when I got this call and got to visit, talk to Terry Kelly, who was the CEO at the time, and talk to her about starting from those leadership skills, thinking future back, and how to create this company you will inherit. And then asking the question, how do we structure that? How involved do you want to be? And some of the big companies we work with, some of the CEOs, they don't want the internal people to be involved very much at all. They want us to give a fresh outside in, kind of to test their inside people. You were really different. What you said is, no, we want to be involved. We want to be involved. So we ended up going through 2 rounds of custom forecasting, building off those skills. But tell us about the structure of that first round, Deborah.
Okay. So in my mind, in Terry's mind, she wanted the strategy to be challenged. In my mind, I wanted to develop these leaders. So those of you who are on our call who also have that role or that interest, you might be executive coaches, you might be inside a company designing cohorts and so forth. But in my case, I wanted them not only to do what the CEO asked for, which was to challenge the strategy in a robust way, but I wanted them to have a profound learning experience. So you gave us the mechanism of requesting a custom forecast for four. And at that time, what we understood it to be was we would get access to everything that IFTF knew from decades of doing this for other companies. So you had such a world of possibilities of what could be in our future. But what you'd want to do is select those that could provide the most disruption or accelerant or whatever might be in our future that we didn't want to miss, that we didn't want to be surprised by. And so that's what we hope the custom forecast would do for us. Out of all this, select the most important things that could impact our future. And then have these leaders actually be part of the curation of all you knew. So in our minds, they were the foot soldiers of your work. Whereas usually IFTF, I understand, would come in and do this. We wanted you to put our leaders to work.
Right.
So they gathered the data. I remember you had them identify the edgies. We still talk about that. Who are the edgies? And for those of you, I think you probably already know, those of you who are on the call, who in your organization are the ones where you just kind of roll your eyes because sometimes they bring up stuff that just seems so off base. And it's actually maybe 7 years later, you find out they were right. You had us gather those. That was one of the most fun parts of our thing, of our engagement with you. But also, we were very careful to design this. We had about 25 leaders from every global area that the company operated in. We also had them from every function. So we call them functions. It's engineering, technology, sales, marketing, the corporate group, operations, of course. And so we had a lot of range. As I said, every region, every function, every business, because we were identified, we had certain divisions that represented different industries. So we designed it with as much as we could in terms of a variety of thought. And so they already brought a lot of information on their own, but we also sent them into their businesses and their regions in order to really bring that forward to the considerations. And then you, as the outsiders, I mean, maybe you can tell, we know what we did to give you that first round of information, but what happens in IFTF when you get that?
Yeah. Yeah. So what we were starting with was asking, what are the 4 or 5 external future forces most likely to disrupt whatever you put in the center? And what you put in the center was this emerging corporate strategy. And you brought these rising star leaders into the center with us and said, okay, you're going to create this outside in forecast, but then we want to present it to your leaders and to your executives. And I remember you used a phrase, Deborah, that really puzzled me at the time, and I'd like you to explain it a bit. You said you want to stand up these 3 leaders, and you pick 3 that were the rising stars. They're kind of rising stars of the rising stars. And you said, I want to stand up these 3 leaders. What did you mean by that?
Well, in this case, they were locally known. I'm trying to, describe this in a way that everybody can take it to their own organizations. Locally recognized as they had great followership. They had significant business capability. They had influential capability. So we chose 3 young leaders, and young and proven. So they really were, as you said, the rising stars and next.
And they weren't so much the edgies. They were in the center with a touch of edginess, but we had more edgies around them.
Correct, exactly. They would have their own edgies that would, really nip at their ankles and make sure they were thinking widely enough. But then what we also did is we matched one. It wasn't a one-on-one match, but there were the 3 emerging leaders, and then we had 3, I would say, more mature, maybe leaders. One was our head of HR. One was someone who'd been at the company 38 years, her whole career there, and was just a profound, often sought after coach. And then I was there as really the program designer, and then also a coach to many of these individuals. Right. It wasn't that each person had their own coach. These 3 had these 3 coaches.
Nice.
And how that showed up was, I mean, they had to present to our senior team at times. They had to present to the board. I mean, talk about everybody in here who knows leadership development knows these are profound and lasting experiences. But, I'd get the call beforehand saying, next week I'm talking to the executive team. Could you please watch me in this meeting and give me some points?
Yes.
And may I please talk about how I want to introduce this? And will you, so they would actually seek us out at all times of day and night in order to help them be profoundly effective. And then they led the group of 25.
Yes, that's an important point, because you're a global company, and these were global leaders. One of the big leaders we were standing up was based in Germany, I remember, and one of them was on the West Coast, and one of them was on the East Coast. But you, in preparing for this, Deborah, you created a couple of summary graphics. Could you share those at this point? And then I want to get in more of the details, but share this kind of conceptual model that was just created. Actually, you're the first group we've shared it with.
Yes, and thanks for our IFTF artist friends. I said, this is what's in my head. And I, obviously remember the Aristotle picture of the guy here. We had an active knowledge where we knew that the best leaders would be a combination of, they would have had several business experiences, hopefully more than one industry. In the case of Gore, we had the medical device division. We had, our then industrial division, which did things like fuel cells way back then. And then we also had, of course, the division that many of you know, which is fabrics. Gore-Tex Fabrics, which of course profoundly started the organization. So they had to have business experience and hopefully multiple businesses. They had to have functional experience and hopefully multiple functions. So you might have been an engineer, but you might have also spent time, in more of a corporate role. You might have started out in sales and marketing, but you might have then gone over to we have this profoundly wonderful role called product specialist, which is really a blend, of both a technical role and a customer facing and learning role. And so those are different functions. And then ideally you'd want, the leaders of your eventual company in the future to have regional experience, to have been in Asia Pacific region, to have been in a European region as well as a US region. And so this was our classic way of trying to build a complex leader, to make sure that they had all these experiences. Now,
Yes.
if you look at our next graphic and you lay that circle down, what we got from working with Institute for the Future was all of that plus time. And at that time, I think, like many companies, the first one we did was in 2014. We had maybe 3-year forecasts, thought out maybe 3 years, maybe the medical division thinking more about 5 because the FDA will require like decades of studies. But certainly it was necessary to think out that far, but no way was it sufficient. And this deep embedded experience with Institute for the Future, I think, changed these leaders. They can't go back. They can't unlearn that you can anticipate the future, that you can create a forecast of likely disruptions. And I know that many of them still. And this is part of their fabric now. It's part of their being, that and immediately in all the businesses, it wasn't 2, 3, 4, 5 years, a minimum of 10.
Yes.
I know several of them are thinking out in terms of decades, and you don't just change that. I mean, that's usually a slow evolution. This was our probably 1 year with you with the first one.
Right.
They were changed. So that's a simple graphic, but I wanted to share.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you did. And we're going to talk now about the two rounds that we did together. But what we brought into that, to a perspective, that kind of cone of time, that's the future back perspective, where what you find is very strong, very talented individuals from a great company who were kind of trapped by this cone of time. And by providing future back, you can kind of see from the outside and say, okay, how can I break through that with innovation? How can I break through that with different ways of thinking about the future? How can I break through that with kind of new insight or new actions? So that was the framework that we were developing in real time, working directly with the CEO, and that created a forecast. And again, what we found is 3 future forces is usually not enough. 6 future forces is too many. 4 is better than 5. So we came up with 4 very compelling headlines, 4 very compelling directions of change. And your Rising Star Leaders actually presented it. I wasn't even there, and our team weren't even there when they went to the board, went to the leadership team. So that was part of it, was to stand these people up and say, okay, we've been thinking about the future. We've had some outside resources, but we're not going to bring in the outsiders. We're going to present this ourselves.
Right. Exactly. And you can imagine what that did for their personal sense of efficacy and agency and influence levels, to watch the perceptions change. You brought up something right then that reminded me. That process of barely strategic thinking to only go out so far was a complete mismatch for an innovation company. Because most profound innovations are going to take way longer than 3 years, 5 years, sometimes 10 years. And so here we had leaders evaluating what to invest in with no sense of what the future could be doing and impacting in our company. So,
Mm.
it was a complete mismatch, absolutely inadequate to be thinking out in terms of business
Yes.
forecasting for 3 to 5 years, when the most profound innovations that would really change who the company could be in the world wouldn't happen,
Yes.
wouldn't mature for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about round two. So, and then we're going to open this to questions soon. So please start putting your questions in the comments. We're going to talk just a few more minutes with Deborah and I. But as we went to round one was with Terry Kelly, the CEO. Round two was with a new CEO. Almost 10 years later. So we were able to look back on a 10-year forecast, and people are always asking us, well, how did you do? How did you do? And the first forecast was really quite accurate, but that's not really the way you evaluate a futurist. That's the way you'd evaluate a fortune teller. Did you predict the future and did it happen? But the way we were evaluated there and the way you were evaluated actually is, did the foresight from round one provoke insight that led to strategy, that provoked action, that actually helped performance? So we had a pretty good track record coming out of that round one, but then you chose to do a round two, again, almost 10 years later. So tell us about round two.
Yeah, and first I'll contrast, just exactly like you said, the first one was CEO initiated. And I really want to share this for our friends on the call, because many of you are going, I don't think I can make that happen in my company. Well, it's great when your CEO wants it. And, all of a sudden the resources are there, the interest is there, the anticipation for what everybody learned was there. And it led to some very significant shifts in our attention. That's what the insights led us to, where we said, we've got to do these three things for us to really work from our strengths and go into the future that we want for this company. Now, we had a new CEO, and I started bugging him about 2 years prior. And actually, he was a very engaging and open and listened well kind of guy.
Yeah.
I finally said, how can you sleep at night knowing that you could know what's coming our way, and having the leaders who are hungry to go continuously learn this, continuously condition themselves for what the signals are and the trends are that we could be perceiving. How can you live with yourself knowing you just write a check and you let me do this and you could have that data? And he laughed. And then over time, we did actually do it. Now, some of you will be intrigued. The approval came in November of 2019. What do we know about that? Well, by the time the contracts were in place and all the wonderful people were selected, we were just heading into the pandemic. And the first program had been so rich and interpersonal, one-on-one, brought all the leaders in to do work. And that was a huge benefit, of course. Have relationships with this team that you're going to end up the leadership team of the company with. Well, he said, don't go to them. They're doing fabulously. Go in. Now, remember, we weren't a real hierarchical company, so it wasn't like don't go lower. Another company would say go to the next lower rung. Ours was circles, go out and get individuals who are really more still doing the work and really moving into larger leadership roles. And so we had to do the whole thing online, virtually.
Yeah.
So in this case, we had two leaders again, two profoundly capable younger leaders, clearly marked for great things. And again, in the model, had two people supporting them. I was doing it, but I tapped a colleague who was from Barcelona, but he was living in Munich during the pandemic, by the way, which is a very isolated experience. And he was profoundly good before anybody else about how to do this sort of stuff online. And not to mention he's a Renaissance man in terms of his thinking. He's as technical as he is business, as he is human, humanly focused. And he was just the perfect second partner. And so we had a different set of objectives. In this case, it wasn't to challenge the strategy and present to the executive team. It was to learn like crazy and present to the Gore board.
Mm.
So we had these kind of mid-career, on the verge of great things people, and that was their assignment. So they had to really, one thing that some of you were, nobody got off to do this like 9-month assignment. They didn't, part of the learning as a future leader was how to get your job done without you being there because you were doing this.
Yes.
And I say that for my colleagues on the call who also do leadership development. This was like, I mean, they really thought before they accepted the invitation because they knew how hard that would be. But that was as much the learning as learning the strategic foresight from you.
Right. I agree. And the other thing we try to do, and Lynn Jeffrey is just really good at this, is to try, when we're doing a foresight project, to understand the things people need to get done already. What's on their do list already. And if you can use our foresight to help you get done what you already have to do, that's a double count. And it turned out we found a number of those double counts, particularly with the Fabrics group, who were doing their own detailed strategy. And we were able to kind of do asides with them. And I think it's important to note how emotional these conversations were, that people tend to think, well, Zoom's not emotional, and oh, virtual isn't emotional. But there was a lot of very close conversation. Particularly we were all under the kind of oppression of the COVID crisis at those times. But when this was done, the last session, I cried. I cried when it was done. And it was all virtual. It was all virtual, where the first round was very in person. We did a lot of things in person. But it's really interesting how you were able to set the tone, and then we were able to facilitate that and look for those double counts, but allow for emotion to enter the forecast.
I think it'd be helpful for our audience to get, since it's way past and it's not proprietary anymore, but in 2014, one of the insights that was ready to affect us, everybody's going to laugh, but it was the Internet of Things. In 2014, that was not known yet.
Yeah.
So think about this, everybody. If you knew before everyone else where that was headed, what kind of edge that gave us. And in our case, because we had an electronics group and we had the medical group, just those, and they were on the same team, they're going, whoa, sensors.
Yes.
No, I mean, this is 2014. Now it's like, yeah, but then it was a really big deal. And it really drove some investigatory teams to go out and see what it could look like. Now, in 2020, that was like all known. But I think the immediacy of environmental requirements, of materials, we're a materials company, requirements, especially in Europe. I mean, you guys got that right up in our faces. And we weren't even finished with the project before there was legislation in Europe around our materials. And to have already gotten some of these working leaders, not at the top, on the phones list, in the boardroom kind of leaders, the working leaders going, time out, we have to really think about this. It gave us such an edge. The other thing I'd like to bring up was that in the first one, we were learning partners, you and us. You think you'd done something like this before, and we'd never done anything like this before. So we were learning foresight and the future's skills as we went. In fact, sometimes you'd have us do something and then say, oh, by the way, what you just did was this.
Yeah.
By the time we did the 2020 group, IFDF had really, I think, refined some beautiful foundational learning. So our group went through your learning that you offer everybody now. And it accelerated us and allowed us to do different things. But I think the biggest thing I saw as an internal was the first group came out and it was almost an immunity response. They were so passionate about what they'd learned. And the organization, the senior team was ready, but the rest of the organization was, what just happened? You're speaking a different language. And we had to really work that. The second one by you having your ability to teach us so refined that many years later, our people not only learned, but they learned how to help others learn.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
it had an amazing impact on the whole organization. In fact, my partner, Danny Dene, who is my technical and buddy partner who has supported the two leaders, he launched a person like a network, a parallel to our effort, because there were so many people who were jealous and wanted to do this, that
Right.
70 people around the world, and all on their own time. And we had early morning call and late night calls to cover the regions. And I think the second one, because of your ability to teach us so cleanly and understandably, that these individuals were ready already to teach
Yes.
others and engage
Yes.
them. So the first one had a profound impact on the thinking of the senior team and the whole strategy of the enterprise. The second one was viral.
Yes. Yeah, it's so important that I think the techniques of teaching foresight are so much better now. And the program that Lynn leads and Aicha is part of, Foresight Essentials, we now have ways of teaching people how to be futurists much faster than we did when this project first began. So I want to open it to questions, but I just want to share one other. You provoked me to remember one of the signals we talked about when we were presenting the audiences around different parts of Gore. One of the signals was incentives, and it was kind of the early stages of Wikipedia, kind of crowdsourcing ideas and crowdsourcing innovation in particular. And I remember one of your senior executives at one of the meetings where the young rising stars were presenting to the established leaders. And one of the established leaders just kind of puzzled and said, wait a minute, you mean the innovation's going to come from the outside in? because the tradition of Gore was you had these brilliant people inside and the innovation went from the outside in, and it was one of those kind of moments in time where you can see a shift and there's signals that indicate the shift. It kind of reminded me at the time we had been working with Procter and Gamble at the early days of the internet when it was evolving from the ARPANET into the internet, the public internet, and the first of the young PhDs joined P&G. And they entered the company and they said, we want to put our internet address on our business cards. And the executive said, no, 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 no internet address on your business card. And of course, that's obvious now. But I think it's part of using signals, using foresight to anticipate these kind of tipping points, and then getting an advantage ahead of them.
Exactly. Yep. And it's still living today.
It still is. Now we're looking for the next ones, the next ones. So Lynn and Aicha, you've been monitoring the questions and answers, and I see there are some popping up there already. Lynn, could you help guide us on questions that we can now open this conversation?
Sure. Yes. So, and thank you, Aicha, for helping us get these together. So there's there's many great questions. There's one question about, it's a little bit kind of just overall, we've talked about a lot of different things. There's 2 rounds. There was a very complex processes. Kind of, could you summarize once more what was asked from the Gore leaders in round 1 and round 2?
Actually have that here. Yes. The Gore leaders in round 1, which concluded in 2014, were to challenge the corporate strategy in a robust way with outside in thinking. That was pretty as clear as I can make it. The mechanism we chose to do this was, and the outside thinkers we chose to work with was the Institute for the Future. And the mechanism that we used for that was to contract for a custom forecast, but to have our people do the work. And then the result was a true challenge to the corporate strategy from these emerging leaders that was all based in their futures work, looking at both signals and trends and identifying with you and with your help the four really significant disruptions that we had not considered. In fact, let me very quickly ask Bob, what is it again? It has to be provocative enough.
Yeah, what our rule of thumb, it has to be provocative without turning people off and familiar enough, but not sound like the same old thing.
There you go. And so our leaders actually worked with you when you had the first drafts in order to say, that's so far out, we just can't even tolerate it, or that is so compelling and we've got to have them listen. So that was the first group. The second group was to really identify, first to confirm or disconfirm the original forecast, just notice what we'd learned and the impact that it had on the organization, and more to really develop the skill of continuously challenging yourself by taking in these indicators of what could be the future. And so we had another custom forecast, and it was different because the other things had already come to fruition. And then to go into the businesses and start to see how they would need to adjust in order to encounter those disruptions or accelerants that were most likely headed our way.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Deborah. So next
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful. Someone wrote, Kelly Ellens from Salesforce wrote, I'd also love to know the general format of these presentations. I've found that forecasts or scenarios can feel really overwhelming. Did you give the forecast and then lay out strategies? And how did the executives feel about non-executives making these suggestions?
What a wonderful question.
Let me give a quick response. Then, Deborah, you can add more how we did it in this case. The general format of our custom forecast is a headline, and we work through many, many, many drafts of the headline to get the sweet spot of provocative without turning people off. So we want memorable and familiar enough, but not sound like the same old thing. Because if you've heard it on the latest podcast, that doesn't work as a provocative future back view. Then we want to have drivers that are summarized, drivers of that. And we think of those as giant waves of change. So those are kind of like trends. Trends are patterns of change you can extrapolate from with confidence. But trends for us that's the easy part. The hard part is what are the breaks in the patterns of change. So the drivers are kind of a hybrid of trends and disruptions. And then we want signals. These, like William Gibson says, the future that's already here but unevenly distributed. And we have this kind of ongoing database of signals from all around the world. And we match those signals to the forecast. But it's all got to be in a very crisp format. Sometimes it's a map. Sometimes it's an annotated PowerPoint. Sometimes it's an executive summary. And we adapted the final deliverable to the Gore culture and kind of what you're used to.
Right. Well, I would like to just give a little detail on the second one. Mm-hmm. So the 2020 group. And we had about 35 leaders in this one. So it's interesting, online and a lot bigger. And we realized, again, from the first one, that these individuals who are so immersed in it, they don't even know what they didn't know before anymore. They've gone to another dimension almost. And their requirement was to come back to the Gore board and have them understand. Mm-hmm. They quickly realized that the first thing they had to do was to till the garden, you might say, create the readiness, and do some teaching. Now, we have really learned to think in terms of future back. So we charged 7 teams of 5 people each to give their personal take on something that they perceived to be in our future. They went to the future, and then they came back. And they're doing this. Each one of them presented to the board. And I remember Bob suggested we all had our own different backgrounds. So you'd have this, very kind of pink background with 5 of them. And then you had this really star background with 5 of them. And so when we were in the gallery, you could see all the teams based on their backgrounds. But each one of them, from their own perspective, helped the board go to the future. I mean, one of them had a garment that they had sent ahead, FedEx, thank you, where they asked the board members to put the garment on, and with the garment came certain capabilities and awarenesses. And they actually put them into the future, already knowing, feeling like they were there. And we did this. It was very rich, very interesting. Could have been overwhelming, but I think they kept just shy of that. And then we presented the forecast. They couldn't have perceived it or assimilated it or been able to move beyond into insight from it if they hadn't had preparation.
Mm.
But remember, we had a talent goal. It wasn't just the forecast. And so our board of directors saw 35 young people, each with a role in helping them think about the future. And I think that was one of the most profound things that happened. You talk about confidence in the future, and that's often a survey question for us organizational people. What's your level of confidence in the future and our leaders to take us there?
Yeah.
Imagine how that impacted it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember, Deborah, you used another phrase that I'd like you to comment on. You wanted in these experiences to help people learn things you can't learn normally, learn things you can't learn until you get in a job.
Yes.
So it's basically to try to do future back learning, to immersive learning. But say a little about that. How do you do things you can't learn until you get in a job?
Well, I think that many of our people on the phone, either they've been this person or they're developing this person. But one of the, I think, executive development challenges is there are some capabilities you're going to need in your role, but all the jobs that lead up to it don't let you learn it or practice it. And I think the big takeaway, and this is like, several years later, I still think it's the big takeaway, is futures work allows people to do that kind of thinking and skill development and skill practice before they have the job.
Mm.
And I'll even list some of the competencies for those of you who are geeks like me. But, strategic thinking, how strategic can you be when you're so operationally prone and this is what you're doing? Systems thinking, most companies really have you focus here and maybe slightly adjacent groups, but at an executive level, you need this huge perspective and ability to do systems thinking, critical thinking, of course, managing ambiguity. Well, your whole focus is try to reduce it when you're managing, but when you're an executive level, you're encountering it. Leading through complexity, leveraging diversity, leading through vision and purpose. You can do that some, but at that scale. So we found that that doing the futures work was an accelerant and often a laboratory of sorts for our leaders to have to think in an executive fashion way before they had the jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. When we talk about immersive learning and the future leadership skill of now augmented immersive learning, what you want to do is to immerse yourself in a future environment so you can learn in low risk ways. And, I teach at the Army War College. They've got this massive training center in the Mojave Desert, where I've come to think of it as the world's largest video gaming parlor. But in that experience, people are actually killed without having to die. That's immersive learning. So the wargaming now is designed to be harder than real warfare. Now in business, we got it a lot easier. We're not trying to kill each other, but it's still the same goal of immersive learning, so we can learn in low risk ways, learn about the future before it happens.
Right.
Lynn?
Yes, so this is a question, Mohammed Marwan, wondering if you are able to come off mute and say a little bit more about the question. I'll give you a moment to do that. And if you're not, let me just share the comment that Mohammed put in. He says, strategy formulation requires multiple input. Outputs of the foresight or futures thinking process should contribute to these inputs, yet still, foresight function is not an active player in the strategy process. So Mohammed, could you just remind us of who your organization is and anything more you'd like to say about your question?
So good morning and good evening, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Yeah. So I'm working as an independent consultant in the field of strategy and other areas. And what I've noticed over the last years is that still, I mean, foresight is, and I'm based in the Middle East. Foresight is still a bit new to us over here. But even with my experience with multinational companies, still the foresight function is not integrated into the whole, strategy process, from formulation to testing the strategy, and then you start with, the choices, execution, the classical strategy process. And this doesn't look like it's getting better, at least from my point of view. So
Mm,
I would wonder if Deborah and Bob would have an input on when we can see actually foresight as an active player in the strategy process. Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, Mohammed. Thank you so much for asking that. And I think you're right. Often foresight is not an active player. The way we think about this, and I'd love to have you comment on this, Deborah. The way we think about this is our foresight, insight, action cycle. So we do the foresight, the independent outside in, to provoke insight. And insight is an aha, kind of a new pattern of thinking. Once you've had an insight, you can't unlearn it, as Deborah says. Yeah, and every great strategy is based on a compelling insight. So strategy lives between insight and action. So what you need is a cycle of foresight, insight, action, and that's what Deborah and her team at Gore were able to create, where the foresight is not the same as the strategy process. It's one of the many inputs. And you certainly don't spend all your time doing it. You spend a small portion, but it's a disciplined portion. It's a committed portion where the foresight is designed to provoke insight. And the insight, foresight's a really good way to provoke insight, even if you don't believe in the forecast. And insight then feeds into strategy. So, Deborah, could you react to that?
Yeah, I like what you said, Bob. I think back even 20 years, and I'm a personal fan and colleague of Julia Sloan, who does
Mm,
strategic thinking work, and
mhm,
she already has people really understanding the tension between just planning and strategy. So the strategic planning is like, what? You know, it's crazy to put those two words together, but you have your planning function that really has to, it's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. But you have your strategy function, and often they are not seen as in relationship with each other because of the tension, but they
mm,
are. Okay, so if we take that learned capability to keep those in mind together, those opposite almost things, then it's almost the same job to do it, to incorporate foresight into it.
mm,
And I think it's almost the same challenge. So how do I do a strategic plan or strategy and integrate the foresight? I do see it as a primary input. I see it as both a discipline, as Bob said, and a talent. There are some people who are really good at it, and they are your early adopters. Now,
yes.
our solution, we never had a strategy group, or even an operational planning group. It was the job of each executive, each leader to be able to accommodate it. So by teaching them the skill and having them go through the transformation that they can't return from, where they will always think about the future, we were able to integrate it very effectively.
Yeah.
I have been at organizations. I was at Dell Computer when it just came out of, startup to established company, and we had the strategy group, and they were often detached.
Yeah.
They used thinking about the future as an excuse to not be in the present. That's not really
Yeah.
fair to say that, but I knew a few people like that.
Yeah.
And so it's always been a challenge. It's
Yeah.
just another flavor of the challenge and requires the same skills.
Right. And let me respond to Mohammed's last observation about how difficult it is to integrate foresight and strategy. I actually think it's getting better. And I'm really optimistic about foresight now being included. And it's part of a realization. We since 9/11, we've talked about the VUCA world, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But we've decided, and in my writing on building that in, VUCA isn't VUCA enough anymore. It's not VUCA enough. And our colleague Jamé Cascio has coined this term Bonnie future, brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. And Jamé and I and Angela Williams, the CEO of United Way Worldwide, are writing a new book about that, about the Bonnie future. In the Bonnie future, it's obvious. It's obvious you have to have foresight in order to do good strategy. And I think that realization is going to hit people, even the most operational are going to have to prepare to be surprised. Even the most operational are going to have to get comfortable being uncomfortable.
Thank you both. We have, I think, time for one more question. And then if you can stay until the very end, I want to tell you about the next Foresight Talks coming up, which is also going to be a really exciting one. So the question is from Taylor Anderson, and it says, thank you for the discussion. Deborah, you mentioned the importance of extending the time horizon that leaders looked towards. While leaders set the example, there's so much commercial inertia centered on the present and near present. Are there important behaviors that accompany the change in mindset to help bring anticipatory thinking into the actions and decisions of today? So it's not just those capabilities that you were talking about. It's really the question is about, are there behaviors that accompany that change that help bring the future into the actions and decisions of today?
I've seen it even earlier. I mentioned earlier that I was with Sematech, the Semiconductor Manufacturing Research Consortium. And even back then, because what we were looking at was the very real problem of creating semiconductors, and we were reaching like natural world restrictions on how small you could get. You know? And it was real, and it was in our faces. And so we actually, at that time, and this is long before I knew you, Bob, but we brought in the world scientists talking about how small can we go? And this was like 1984, and they were saying, we're going to have to go to maybe biology is how we make circuits in the future, because those guys are really small, you know? So, you know, I think that if you can really show the risk to your current thinking, and then for those who do better in a toward than in a way, show the possibilities and excitement that are possible. Kind of like with our CEO, I had to, when I couldn't get him to be excited about what he could know, I didn't quite shame him, but I certainly challenged him on, how do you sleep at night not knowing this? You know, when it's knowable. So that was dramatic, and I had a good relationship with him. But it's still, I think we're always going to have the two sides. Some are going to be compelled toward what's possible, and some are going to be only off the dime when they figure out the risks involved. I don't know if that human factor's changed.
Yeah. So just one practical behavior that I think is really important is cross-generational learning. And certainly this is built into your program, Deborah, learning across generations. Everything we do at the Institute now is cross-generational.